Welcome back to season 2 of The Conscious Artist. I am so excited to be here with you all again, and I just want to say thank you for all of your support during the first season. The response has been amazing, and I just love the community that we are creating together. As you guys know, I started this podcast because I wanted us to have a safe space to share our experiences and have those difficult conversations around mental health. So thank you for allowing me to share this journey with you, and I can't wait for you to see what's in store in season 2. Let's get started. Welcome back to another episode of The Conscious Artist, a safe space for conversations around mental health awareness for musicians, artists, and all human beings. I am your host, Pallavi Mahidara. I'm a concert pianist and teacher, and I am absolutely thrilled that you are joining us today. My hope for this show is that it will give all of us a sense of solidarity and knowledge that we are not alone, and together, through these conversations, we can create more awareness and change for a healthier future. Today's guest is so multi-talented, I don't know even where to begin. She is a Cuban-Chinese cellist and interdisciplinary artist who grew up between New York, Paris, and Berlin. Along with solo cello performances, she is conversant and active in various artistic disciplines, including fashion, film, photography, and visual art. She has also volunteered and donated work to multiple organizations to raise funding for free and accessible arts education, and currently serves as artist ambassador for the Grammy Music Education Coalition. Please join me in welcoming Sophia Bacelar to the show.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
It's a pleasure. I barely said 1% of the things you've done in this intro because I thought it would just be easier to let you speak about your own accomplishments and musical education. So I was wondering, would you mind sharing with us how you came to find interest and love in so many different artistic realms?
That's really kind of you because I always wake up with major imposter syndrome and wonder what I'm doing with my life. So when I hear my bio like that read back to me, I'm like, okay, it's all right. I haven't been doing nothing with my entire existence. Yeah, so the way I got into the arts was my father was a cellist and his mother, my grandmother, was a painter. So they came to the States as refugees from Cuba, and they kind of had this very, it's a very Cuban attitude that you DIY everything yourself. So my father, as he was going through school, he never had money for instruments. And at one point, he was like, I'm just going to make my own cello. And everyone thought he was completely crazy until he actually did it. So he started working on instruments throughout his 20s when he was in conservatory. And then I think he kind of did it simultaneously along with his performing career for his 20s and 30s. And then eventually it sort of took over his life and he became a full-time luthier. And so as a result of that, I was born into a household with a lot of instruments around. And because of my grandmother, whenever I would go to her house, there were just, there was an artist studio and paintbrushes and pencils. And so it was very, very natural that I just gravitated towards music and visual arts. So when people ask me why I became a cellist and if it was really my choice, it's a question I've asked myself a lot throughout my life. And I think it's a combination of nature and nurture. So it was a very natural part of my environment, but it was also something I really wanted to do because even though I've had questions about that throughout my whole life, I don't think I would have stuck with it to the point that I have and played for, I guess, 24 years at this point if it hadn't been something I truly, truly loved. So that was kind of my relationship with music. And it just happened that because I started going to pre-college at Juilliard when I was 10, music took over eventually. I mean, I was playing piano also, and I did a minor in composition. And I was still studying art the whole time. I'm half Chinese, half Cuban. So I was studying Western art with my grandmother. And then I was studying Chinese calligraphy and watercolors with a very renowned Chinese painter. So I think the first time I realized that I could combine my love of visual arts and music was when I was 15. I was studying at the MoMA, which is the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And I have this memory of running out of orchestra at Juilliard and then going down to 54th Street and then wandering around the galleries and just getting really inspired by everything there. And at the time, there was an exhibition about music. And two things really, really stuck out to me. I remember there was a piece that was a video installment that featured piano. And I realized how much it captivated me in the sense that it was stimulating both my visual sense and my auditory sense. And the other, completely unrelated, but later became very important for me, thing that happened was that it was the first time I listened to Jay-Z's Empire State of Mind. There was like a set of headphones built into the wall in one of the areas in this exhibit, and I put them on and I was just completely like blown away by this music. And I'd had so much classical training that I wasn't too exposed to non-classical forms of music at that point beyond pop and whatever my friends were listening to, which was mostly like Avril Lavigne. And I mean, I love Avril, but it was very kind of
like
pop,
2000s.
like 2000s, like, yeah. It's interesting because it was the first time, like I saw so many different forms of both visual art and music existing in the same space. And eventually, for the final project, I actually ended up creating a piece for cello and electronics. And originally, I had wanted to do it with dance and create a short film. And then because I got sick for a month and there were all these time constraints, it ended up just being an audio piece. But it was the first time I really worked between different mediums. And that was part of an exhibition that all the students put on at the museum, which was really important for me because I think it was the first time I realized that it was legitimate for me to take from all these different fields and create something of my own, and that it would actually be accepted in some sort of real way and people would actually listen to it.
Wow. Honestly, it makes a lot of sense now hearing your story, why you're so involved with so many different artistic realms, and it's incredible. And I want to backtrack to something you said about imposter syndrome. I'm glad you brought that up because I think it's very important for our listeners to see this sort of Instagram versus reality contrast actually reflected in someone's story.
Yes.
And, I see how many things you do. And from the outside, I would never guess that imposter syndrome or anxiety was ever a concern. But it just goes to show that we never really know what someone is going through. Where do you think some of the anxieties stem from in your own life? Where do you think they sort of originated?
Anxiety is something I've done a lot of research on and spent a lot of time dealing with in my life. And I think the earliest manifestation of it was in the form of stage fright. And it's very interesting because people nowadays think of me as an extrovert and they think that I'm very social and have very good people skills, but that was not the case for me growing up. I was homeschooled. I was a very weird child. Still am. But I was
I
actually
wouldn't say weird. I would say super eclectic and cool.
yeah, that's what they call it now. But yeah, when I was a kid, I never really had friends, and I was actually bullied quite a lot, to the point that I left school when I was 10 and I became homeschooled. And so it's interesting that now people think of me as someone who's very comfortable socially, because it was actually a skill I had to learn, and I invested a lot of time and energy and research into learning it. So there was that component, which was, I guess, part of my personality and part of my being. And then there was the performer side of it. I started playing cello when I was 2. It was something that was so natural for me. And I never had any stage fright as a kid. I remember I always loved performing. For me, I played my best when I had an audience. I loved playing concerts. And it was all just really enjoyable until it was a very, very clear moment in my mind. I remember it was after my first international competition. I developed this major anxiety and stage fright to the point that for years and years I was terrified of performing. And every time I got on stage, my legs would shake, my hands would shake. I could barely get through a piece. And the way it started was it was very clear that it happened right after this competition. And I had this incident where, for me, cello was always something I did. I wouldn't say for fun. I think for all of us who start so young, there isn't the notion of what a profession is yet, but it's such an important
Mm.
part of your life that you do take it seriously. It's more than a game. It's more than something you're doing just like as a hobby. But I noticed in the months leading up to this first big competition, there was a lot of pressure on me. And I was about 12 years old at the time to win, obviously. And I was studying at Juilliard, which was an extremely competitive and not always very supportive environment, meaning amongst the students. I think there was a lot of rivalry and a lot of a competition that wasn't always healthy. And so I think it was the first time where I felt like what I was doing musically had an outcome, and the outcome was a very clear good or bad, whether I won or didn't. So I remember I traveled to South Korea and I did not win. And I remember I went to the jury for comments after I played. And I spoke to the head of the jury. Everyone on the jury gave me constructive criticism. There were obviously, things they pointed out, which were valid. Looking back, a lot of their comments were completely valid about my playing. And then I went to this one guy, and I remember he just looked at the sheet of paper where he'd taken notes about my playing, and he basically just gave me a laundry list of like everything that could possibly be wrong. So he was like, your intonation's terrible, musically terrible, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. And he ended the whole thing by looking me in the face and telling me, the way you play, you'll never win a competition and you'll never be successful on stage. I thanked him because I had no idea how to process what was happening. And then I left the room and basically sobbed for like the entire day and night. And I think that was the first time where I realized that what I was doing could result in this, I've always felt like anxiety is, in all areas of life, it's this fear of, it's the manifestation of fear, and the fear is of approval or non-approval. I mean, in today's life, I mean, obviously there are fearful situations that are actually dangerous, but it's very rare that nowadays we're being attacked by a lion or something like that.
No,
Most,
no, you're right. Like a
yeah,
lot of anxiety actually is thought based.
exactly. And I think in today's society, it's very rare that any of us day to day actually face imminent danger. So most of the anxieties we experience are mostly due to, fear of social rejection and desire for social approval. So going back to this first event, that was just one big defining event in my life where I realized that something I was doing, which is playing the cello, which seemed like such an innocuous thing that I enjoyed, could result in such a big sense of rejection and failure. And that, I think, started this whole feeling of I'm not good enough and wondering what people thought of me. And it was something
Mm.
that I think it also coincided with, just in terms of psychological development, when people hit age 13 and they start their teens, that's when people really develop this sense of self-consciousness. And so I think the fact that this event happened at that point in my life and my development, and it was such a jarring thing, it really, really caused just so much anxiety and fear in me. And for years and years, this really, really colored actually a lot of my life. So yeah, that's kind of how it started. And then I went on this huge journey. I remember when I was 16, I was auditioning for the Paris Conservatory, and I realized that I had to really deal with this stage fright thing because I couldn't even play the auditions without freaking out. So I started doing a lot of research. And at the time, this was 10 years ago, but there was very little literature and there were very few resources available for musicians in this area, but there was a ton available for sports, for athletes. And I think sports
Yeah.
psychology is something so fascinating, and it's something into which people have, devoted so much energy, time, and resources to really understand how to make athletes perform at their best. So what I did was actually I read tons of sports psychology books and studied how athletes train mentally so that I could apply the same principles to performance or auditions, because it's essentially the same thing that's going on in us mentally. It's something happening in real time, like, a sports match. And it's something that creates a lot of pressure. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves and we train for it for a long time. So I realized that even though on the surface, kicking a ball and pressing down keys on a piano might be totally different things, what's happening to us internally is actually very similar. So that was kind of where I started this whole obsessive research on like anxiety and fear and understanding human psychology. And it actually helped a lot. I did take that audition. I did get in. I moved to Paris. And then I faced a totally different form of anxiety, which was suddenly having to operate in a new language. And I remember, I'd grown up, I'm mixed race. I grew up in the United States. And actually, I mentioned earlier that I left school because I was bullied. I was bullied for not being white. So that was something that
Mm.
had been a source of insecurity in me for a long time. And then I moved to Europe where I had to learn a foreign language and start to do all my classes and give oral essays and everything in this new language. And I observed in myself how closed off I became as a person, because similarly, there was another very jarring event in my first week of school. I was in the cafeteria and I did speak French. I had learned it, but there was something on the menu that I didn't understand. Like, I didn't know the name of the dish. So I asked my then boyfriend to translate it for me, and he was explaining to me what this thing was. And the cafeteria lunch lady, she just turned to me and she was like, "Go back to China," and went on this whole rant about how I didn't speak French and I didn't belong there. So it was this big initial social rejection that I experienced as a student there. And because of that, the next 2 years of my studies there, I did complete my undergraduate there, but it was extremely difficult because the whole time I felt this constant feeling of social rejection. And it also colored my performance, of course, because I was very shy to play. But one of the things that was interesting was, I remember towards the end of my degree, there was a class performance where we all the cello students in my class played. And it was one of the first times that people actually talked to me. And it was after I played that they spoke to me, and they suddenly became really nice to me. And I realized also, like, two things. One, that music is this universal language that we all share and understand. And when someone hears something, which I guess what people told me, I mean, I guess they liked the way I played if they were nice to me. But once I sort of crossed that, I realized there had always been this social boundary between me and the students there, because I was this foreigner. But once I played, they suddenly accepted me, and it was another example of how, like I said, art can transcend these social barriers, and also how much of a difference it can feel as a person when you're suddenly socially accepted by a group. During those 2 years, I was so shy to the point that most people thought I was autistic, because I just didn't ever
Mm.
speak, because I had this huge fear of, saying something wrong or messing something up. And eventually, when I moved back to the States when I was 18, I moved back to New York for about 9 months. I realized that I really had to make a change in my personality, because by then I'd understood that having a career in the arts is not just how you make your art, it's also dealing with people and having stage presence and being able to interact
Yeah.
with audience members, and just have nowadays it's much more. And there are people who think this is a good thing and people who think this is a bad thing, but it's not just about the playing, it's also about the persona. So
Yeah.
interestingly, at that point, I kind of realized that I had this major social problem. I couldn't look people in the eye. I could barely talk to them. I was really nervous. So I actually then put in a ton of research into public speaking, and I read a lot of books and listened to a lot of lectures and podcasts and interviews with people in the business world, because having good public speaking skills is so vital to people who are in that realm. And so I actually spent years and years, probably between age 18 and 22, 23, researching behavioral psychology and how people perceive one another on a visual and not just a visual sense in terms of body language, but just how you interact with people. So, after all this research, and now I'm at a point in my life where, I still secretly think I'm super awkward and nervous and weird, but other people don't pick up on it as much. I've learned that it's something that you can work on and you can learn and improve, like a skill, like anything else in life.
100%. 100%. Wow. Oh my goodness. There's so many things that I want to respond to. I'll go backwards, just because I completely agree with you about, learning to speak to other human beings and actually engage with like normal social skills and normal human interactions. These are skills that can be developed. And some people are very, they're called like a people person, right? Like when you're really good
Exactly.
at interacting with people and engaging with people and you're charming or you're charismatic, and people automatically assume you're an extrovert. And then you don't speak, you don't engage with someone, you kind of keep to yourself, and then people think you're an introvert. But it's not black or white. It's not either or. And I learned a term today, which I think describes me very well, which is ambivert,
Yes,
which is
that's what I
like,
call myself.
right,
Yeah.
an extroverted introvert, basically. Like some people are shocked to find out that I identify as an introvert because they've only seen me in social settings where I am in a group of friends and feel extremely comfortable and safe,
Right.
and then I can be my open self. And like you, I have had to work a lot on really improving my people skills and my public speaking skills. I didn't take a course or anything, but what I did in my life was to start speaking to the audience before a performance. So whenever I would give, growing up, since I was a young teenager, I started doing this. I would introduce my program, and it taught me, first of all, to make sure that I didn't just play the pieces that I was playing, but that I actually was doing research around the piece and the composer and the timeline, and what art was being created at that time, and what wars were happening at that time, and what was the political situation in that country. And then it taught me, how do I project my voice? How do I engage people when I'm speaking? How do I, share something that's important to me in a way that others can relate to, just like we do with our instruments? And yeah, so I definitely, I'm right there with you. It's definitely a skill that can be trained, and I think is very important today. As you say, it's not just how you play, but it's also who you are. But who you are to the public eye, not necessarily who you are authentically, which is part of the issue I sometimes feel with the whole business aspect of the artistic world. Talking about imposter syndrome before, I think in order to help avoid imposter syndrome, in order to help avoid feeling disconnected with ourselves or imbalanced or out of place, or to help deal with anxiety, the best we can do is to just try to stay as authentically connected to who we are while helping to push ourselves out of our little comfort boxes.
Yeah, and there's actually something, I think when we spoke on the phone a couple weeks ago, I might have mentioned this. One thing that I did a lot of research on and I found really helpful was there's something called fear setting exercises. And they're basically these silly little exercises that you put yourself through that are completely ridiculous, but actually cause a lot of fear and anxiety. So I think one of them is like going into a Starbucks and just lying down on the floor in the middle of the cafe. Or it's something, I might be mixing up two different ones, but I think that's one of them. Or there was one that I used to do a lot when I was living in New York, which was basically just to walk down the street and say hello to every single person you run into, which
Mm.
sounds ridiculous and sounds really simple. But when you actually have to do it, you realize how anxious and kind of fearful you get. And the thing is, it's interesting because what it teaches you is that what you're actually afraid of is you're afraid of looking ridiculous. But
Totally.
in reality, when you do these things, you'll realize that there is no actual danger in them. And one of the things I used to kind of tell myself at one point when I was dealing with a lot of stage fright was, nothing I do on stage actually is that important. I'm not trying to sort of negate the value of what music and art are, but in the sense that, if
You're not
I'm not,
ruling a country.
yeah, I'm not ruling a country. I'm not piloting a plane. I'm
Yeah.
not doing anything that puts anybody's life at risk. It was interesting because one time I was having dinner with a friend and her husband, who's a lawyer. And it was right before I was about to play a competition. And we were talking about how, I was experiencing anxiety. And then I was like, you know what? This is a guy who, when he goes to trial, if he loses, his client might go to jail, or they might, something
Yeah.
really serious might happen. If I lose this competition, literally nothing bad happens. Like, my life goes on, everyone's life goes on. And I think the other thing that's really interesting is something I've observed in my professional life and in my personal life. And I'm guilty of still doing it sometimes today. And I'm very aware of it. So I catch myself and I try to stop myself before I get on this train of thought when it happens. But I think one of the reasons why we experience a lot of anxiety around whatever is happening, whatever specific event that's making us anxious, is that we create this narrative about the outcome we want, and we attach so much emotional weight onto this outcome and this expectation that when it doesn't go completely according to plan, because of course nothing in life ever goes 100% according to plan, we feel this loss of control. And then it's suddenly like, oh my God, I was so attached. There was such a strong attachment to this exact specific outcome I needed that now I can't deal with the present. And it's interesting because something I've realized in my life, and I think the biggest curveball all of us artists felt was obviously COVID, because at the beginning, I remember I and a lot of my friends had this huge anxiety because we felt like we would never work again. And we felt like our
Mm.
entire life's work was now just thrown out the window. And, basically we'd wasted our lives training to do something that could no longer be done. And that was like the biggest sort of disturbance of the plan that I'd set out for my whole life. And, the first 6 months were probably some of the worst in my life, in the sense that I just had no idea what I was doing. And
Mm.
I was just crippled with anxiety. I mean, I would wake up every day in a panic, or I would, not be able to sleep, or conversely, I would just sleep like 16 hours a day to not deal with reality. So it was definitely a
Mm.
mix of anxiety and depression. And finally, I think about 6 months in, beginning of September, I decided, at that point, I really felt like there was not much hope for music anytime soon, at least in the sense of going back to live performance. So I had the option, because I was doing my artist diploma at Juilliard at the time, to do an exchange with Columbia University. And completely on a whim, I decided to study film, purely because, and I'll be totally transparent about this, I thought studying film would be fun and easy because I would watch movies all day. And of course, that's not what happened at all. When I was, it was a lot of like reading, and it actually reminded me quite a lot of being in conservatory, because we were analyzing films, we were studying film history, we were studying film techniques. And it was actually amazing for me because, it was a totally random decision to study film. And then a couple of months later, there was a grant available for musicians, actually. And at the time, because I'd already been working quite a bit in the year before the pandemic with dance, I decided to apply for a grant to produce a short film which incorporated contemporary dance and cello. And a couple months later, in February of 2021, I was sitting at home still kind of not really totally sure what I was doing with my life. And I got this call out of the blue from a friend of mine who was in San Francisco, who's the conductor of the San Francisco Ballet. And it was really funny because he had been posting, we always joke that he and I are huge foodies, and his entire Instagram feed is just like delicious food. So I was basically like replying to every story with like heart emoji, like the emoji with the heart eyes and like the drooling mouth. And then finally he's like, why don't you just come out here and we can go to dinner? And I was like, well, we're in the middle of a pandemic. I can't really justify flying out to California. This was before anyone was vaccinated, to go to dinner. So he was like, you know what, the San Francisco Ballet, they're almost done with their virtual season because everything was virtual. He's like, why don't you just come out here? We'll put together a project with them and a couple of the dancers, and then we can go to dinner. So basically, I was like, you know what? I'm not doing anything with my life right now. I'm sitting here watching films all day. Why not? I can do that there too. So I kind of packed up my stuff, took my dog and my cello, and bought a one-way ticket to San Francisco. And this tiny little project that I'd originally wanted to do, which was my conception for it had just been, get a dancer, do a split screen thing, film it myself, write the music, record it all kind of in a very DIY sense. It ended up turning into this much bigger project where we actually shot in a building which is now the home of Douglas Kane's restaurant Cyrus, and featured Sasha DeSola, who's a principal dancer at SF Ballet, and choreography by Miles Thatcher, who's a soloist and choreographer at SFB. And basically the funny thing is that, so we shot this project and I ended up becoming such good friends with everyone involved that I stayed in San Francisco for 4 months. And during that time, it was this whirlwind it was, spring 2021. Things were still kind of uncertain. Not much was happening in terms of performance. And I basically kind of wandered around the city exploring, eating a lot of food. And eventually at one point I walked into like a martial arts gym. I had no experience with martial arts. I didn't know what jiu-jitsu was. I walked in, I took a class, and I became so addicted that I prepaid for 6 months of lessons and started going every single day. And that
Wow.
interestingly started this huge journey for me. So two things. I'll go back to the martial arts separately because that's a longer discussion. But what I realized is, I was doing all these seemingly random things at the time, like hanging out in restaurants, wandering around Chinatown in San Francisco, biking along the beach, going to random events, meeting people. And it all felt like I was not doing anything very productive in terms of my identity as a classically trained cellist and what I was supposed to be doing with my life. And I often had this feeling of, it was almost like I was distracting myself from the anxiety of I can't work and I don't know what I'm doing professionally with all these other activities. But interestingly now, because it's exactly a year later, I see how much all of those seemingly meaningless things that I was doing at the time have actually come back and influenced my career. One of the craziest things is that I just released this project I did with San Francisco Conservatory of Music, which I curated, and I worked alongside their technology and applied composition department to create. And the funny thing is, this time 1 year ago, just by coincidence, because I happened to move into an apartment on the same street as the conservatory, I considered applying to that program as a student because I was interested in learning about electronic music and how I could use it alongside my acoustic cello and create something kind of more contemporary and modern. And so a year ago, I was kind of looking into like their website's application page. And then a couple weeks later, I was in a dive bar after my jujitsu class, and I met someone randomly who recognized me as a cellist. He knew me from YouTube, I guess. And he was telling me about what was going on in the school administratively. And he was telling me I should apply for a teaching position. And I was like, there's no way I'm qualified to teach cello. Absolutely not. I'm like 25 years old. No. But it kind of got me thinking. And then a couple weeks later, there was this one restaurant where I used to hang out a lot because I'd become friends with the chef, and I was kind of taking cooking lessons with her. And, I was eating there so often that I decided to sort of give something back to the restaurant. And I offered to play a little concert for them and their patrons, and kind of put together like a tasting menu and like a food wine tasting menu, along with
Oh,
like
wow.
30 minutes of music. So I did that purely just because I'd been getting a lot of free food and I felt like I should give something back. And then just by coincidence, one of the people who came to the dinner was a board member from San Francisco Conservatory. And I started talking to her about the person I'd met in the dive bar and how I'd been interested in the program. And from there, I got an introduction to the dean. And a couple months later, it was kind of like, it blew my mind. I was like sitting in the conservatory, living in their housing, and having a meeting with the dean, talking about my ideas for how I thought classical music should evolve, and how technology could be applied to our classical training. So it was
Wow.
kind of funny how all these random things ended up actually being really, really influential in terms of, quote unquote, my professional career. And this idea of controlling the narrative and being, like I said, going back to what I was saying earlier, constantly being so attached to, things have to happen in this sequence of events, and XYZ has to go this way so that I get to this goal and accomplish this, that can often be very limiting, I've found, because when you sort of go with the flow, there are all these unexpected things that can occur that actually end up being a huge net positive towards your entire life.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to go with the flow is something that some people have a great talent and natural draw towards, and other people, like me, for example, have spent their lives trying to control things that are absolutely not in their control.
Yeah.
And, going back to something that you said earlier regarding sports psychology, as you were talking about how there wasn't a lot of information that you could find on musicians dealing with anxiety and sort of stage fright and all this stuff, but you found that a lot of sports psychology was relevant. It reminded me of this book, which possibly many people might know, called The Inner Game of Tennis by Timothy
Yes.
Gallway. And I remember when I read that book the first time, I was like, I can apply every single one of these tools and skills and tricks to the piano and to teaching and to playing. And it was really fascinating because at the end of the day, we are training ourselves to either be anxious and worried or confident and secure. And literally, that all
Yes.
just comes from our thoughts.
Exactly. And it's interesting to me how much I've realized throughout the years that my thoughts, because I'm someone who naturally my whole life was also very much a control freak, and I've always wanted to control everything around me. And it's something that I know is in my personality, and I think being aware of it helps me fight it. It's funny because on one hand people think I'm the most spontaneous person, and I really am.
That's what it
Um
seems like when I see
yeah.
your stuff on Instagram.
Oh yeah, no, I am. Like I'm it's this weird dichotomy because I am the most spontaneous person ever. Like I've moved cities multiple times, like on a whim, and it's like a split second decision, and in 3 hours I have a plane ticket and I've packed up my
Wow.
stuff. It happens quite often.
Wow.
So there's that side of me. But then there's this internal side of me. I feel like externally I'm very go with the flow, but internally, especially when I get very emotionally attached to something, and I've seen this manifest in everything from I want to win this cello competition, or in my personal life, it's like in my dating and relationships, that's where I've seen it manifest a lot, where if I like someone, I get a huge attachment to them and I really want to be with them. And when that doesn't happen, I feel this huge like unsettling. And I used to get such bad anxiety whenever I didn't get messages back from people.
Oh
I was,
yeah,
yeah,
very annoying.
I interpreted it very much as like a rejection or a loss of control over the narrative. And I mean,
Oh yeah,
it's
it's
so,
like, oh, they're mad at me. They don't like me anymore. They think I'm stupid. They
exactly.
think, oh yeah, completely.
Yeah, and it's something, it's interesting because it's happened just as strongly in my professional life and in my personal life. So
Yep.
everything
Yep.
from I've sent an email to someone I'm trying to work with or ask for something and they don't answer and then I freak out.
Or
That was
you
something.
apply for a competition and you don't get in, and now you think, now we think, oh
Exactly.
my God, I can't play my instrument. I'm a terrible person.
Yeah,
That
and
like
yes.
destructive thought process.
And so I think this was something, so it's something I've worked on, and actually now is the first time in my life where I actually feel very settled in both areas. And it's because it used to be, like you said, like I would take, if I didn't get into something, if I didn't win something, if I didn't get something I applied for, I would feel this huge sense of personal failure. Like it wasn't just like, okay, I got
Yes.
rejected from this thing. It's like I'm worthless as a human because I
Yeah.
was so attached to the thing. And I had a really bad breakup around probably 3 months into COVID. And that coincided with this time in my life where I felt like my professional life had fallen apart. And then I also felt like my personal life had fallen apart. The relationship, I won't get too much into it, but there was a lot that happened that was extremely unhealthy. And as a result of it, I ended up in probably the worst place I've ever been emotionally and mentally, because I felt this, in my professional life, everything was gone. And in my personal life, just this total feeling of rejection and this feeling of like not being worthy. A lot of people don't know about this, and it's, we could do an entire conversation just on the subject itself, but I had a lot of trauma after this relationship because it was extremely abusive on multiple levels. And I can talk about it now actually because I did so much therapy to process it, and now I'm totally fine speaking about it even publicly. But at the
Yeah.
time, the thing, when it ended, it was so traumatic that I actually moved out of New York City and went back to live with my parents. And I was so afraid of the entire world that I actually didn't leave the house for almost 7 months. I think it was 6 or 7 months. And it was to the point that actually my best friend, if she tried to hug me, I would completely panic. So that was something I was processing a lot in 2020, 2021. When I did that whole move to San Francisco, going back to the martial arts thing, I was starting to obviously venture out of home. I was starting to be more comfortable with the world, but I still had major, major anxiety and huge triggers. I would freak out if people tried to get close to me or if I felt emotionally vulnerable. So around that time, I just happened to, like I said, completely randomly walk into a martial arts gym. And I didn't know what jujitsu was, but the first time I did it, I felt so relaxed because I realized, for those of you who aren't familiar about jujitsu, it's basically, I mean, this is a terrible summary of what it is, but a lot of it is basically putting people into submission and learning how to get out of those positions. And for someone who had I felt this loss of power and loss of control over my entire life. In that first class, when I realized that I could be in a position of, losing control and then actually learn how, through this sport and through the skills that we learn in jujitsu, learn how to get out of that situation and regain your control. Philosophically, it just kind of really resonated with where I was, and I became completely addicted to it. And it really helped rebuild my confidence because I realized that no matter what happens, like someone can have you in a chokehold, there's a way if you know how to get out of it. And that really, really impacted my whole life. I eventually also started doing Muay Thai and boxing, and just this whole feeling. I really, honestly, I recommend it to everyone. even though I know most musicians are very hesitant to try martial arts for obvious reasons because of, hand safety. But there is a way to do it very safely. I've been doing it for a year, and I have felt this huge sense of confidence and strength that I regained through kind of regaining control of my body. And I realized that, for all of us psychologically, so many things, whether it's something that is a real physical danger or an imagined danger or a mental danger, there are ways to control the thoughts that are going on when you're in these situations, and learn to master them the same way you would master a potentially compromised physical situation.
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you so much for your vulnerability and your honesty and for sharing this story with us. Thank you for trusting me in this space. I really appreciate it because I know that you are not alone in your experiences, not only on stage with your instrument, but also in your personal life. And it must have been such a powerful feeling, starting jujitsu and actually learning to, as you say, not only take control physically, but also mentally of
Yeah,
yourself and of situations around you. And I love how you said that, you can be in a position of a seemingly hopeless or a
right,
seemingly submissive position where one feels like, what can I do to protect myself? What can I do to save myself? What can I do to strengthen myself? And many of us don't have those tools physically, and many of us
right.
don't have those tools mentally. And like you, I think I felt less of a loss of direction professionally because during the pandemic, especially the first 6-7 months of the lockdown, because I was still teaching a lot, and that gave me a sense of direction and purpose. And it's something like, I've been teaching for almost 20 years, so it's something that I really love doing, but it also kept me going and kept me actually playing my instrument because without concerts, sometimes it's like, well, what am I practicing for? you
Exactly.
know?
Yeah.
And like you, I had some big things happen in my personal life during 2020 and 2021. And going to therapy, I talk about this a lot in many episodes in my first season, but going to therapy changed my life, completely changed my life, and allowed me to access so many tools and skills that I already had in my toolbox that I was not aware of.
Yeah, well, first of all, I recommend therapy for everybody. I think it doesn't matter what field you're in. All of us, on some level, have experienced some form of trauma or anxiety or fear. We
Yes,
all
yes.
have baggage. We all have something that's influencing our performance day to day, regardless of what we do. And so I think it's really important. And one of the most interesting things about therapy was that at the beginning, I first started therapy actually in 2019. And I've seen several therapists, and I've done a lot of research into different fields. I've kind of experimented with a lot of techniques. I've also done a lot with meditation and mindfulness and gone into that whole realm as well. But the most important thing I've actually felt about therapy was I was, people were telling me to go into therapy for years before I started. And I was extremely reluctant because what I kept telling people was, there's just so much to talk about that I don't want to deal with it. Because if I open up, it's like, if I start talking about this, it's like opening up a Pandora's box. It's not going to
Yeah.
end. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
And it
I
can
was
be
like,
terrifying.
it's terrifying. And also there was just so, it just seemed like such a daunting task. It was almost like a closet you haven't cleaned out in a really long time. And it's like, I
Hmm.
just want to close the door and keep it shut and not look at all the
Right.
junk, because if I open it, everything's going to spill out. So I was definitely very avoidant for many, many years. And finally, when I did start, it was like that closet spilling out. And there was so much. I remember it was so funny in my initial meeting with my first therapist with whom I worked for a while. And she was really wonderful. She asked me to write up just a sort of like initial self-assessment, kind of letting her know anything I wanted her to know, and it was 15 pages long. And
Oh my God.
it was like a bio going through my entire life. Like, this traumatized me, this was terrifying, this thing happened. No, it wasn't all bad. Obviously good things have happened in my life too, but that's generally not what you go to therapy to talk about.
Right. Right.
So when I started dealing with it, I realized that one of the most important things was actually just being forced to sit and verbalize all these things, because deep down, even the most avoidant people, I think, must have some they must have some feeling of, there's something here I should deal with, maybe I should look into this. And I think in the back of my mind, I always knew what my issues were. And what therapy really taught me was to just be extremely honest with myself, because, nobody's perfect. And I realized in a lot of the stuff I addressed in therapy, I was also part of the problem in a lot of the situations that were making me unhappy,
Yeah.
whether I
Yeah.
was complicit in them or actually causing them. There was a little bit of both. It's never like everything is everyone else's fault and I'm just
No, no,
this
no,
innocent. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, to take accountability and to be willing to look inside and say, hey, actually, this is on me. That takes a lot of courage.
absolutely. And so it's interesting. A friend of mine who's been in therapy for probably much longer than I have, at one point I stopped and he encouraged me to go back, because at that point I was like, I kind of know what's up and I feel kind of okay. It's not like I'm in crisis mode and I need someone to be counseling me. And he was like, I have been in therapy for probably more than 10 years. And he's like, I still go to therapy every single week, even if things feel pretty fine and it's been a very normal week with nothing jarring happening, because he's like, I consider it almost like an insurance on my emotional
Right. Like a
and mental state.
checkup.
It's
Like
like a checkup.
it's just like preventative measures.
Yeah, exactly. Because he said also, you want to have a relationship with a therapist who knows you, so that when the actual crisis or trigger occurs, they know you and they can work with you because they have that history with you. Because the
Mm.
worst thing, I think, which is what happened to me actually the first time I went into therapy, was that there was a crisis situation. And then I suddenly was brought into this new person I didn't know. And I had to give her 15 pages of backstory to even start with day one. I remember there was one point a couple months ago in the fall where similarly I had done a lot of work with two therapists this last fall, and I was at a point where I was traveling a lot and I was really busy, and there were times where I was almost like, do I really need to see them this week? It's, nothing has really changed, I'm fine, nothing's happening. And then I still saw them because I realized it's just a good habit to force yourself to really sit with your thoughts. And sometimes I find that it's easier just to say them out loud to another person and things will come out that you
Mm.
didn't even really think about yourself. Obviously, journaling is another really wonderful practice that I encourage. And
Yes.
I've
Yes,
sorted out
yes,
a lot
yes.
of stuff just through journaling, because it's actually amazing. Like, I think one of the things I struggled with journaling when I was younger was that I was basically trying to write like a novel in my, like, I wanted it to be like beautiful prose and properly punctuated. And it got to the point where I was like, I'm spending so much time. It was also handwritten, and then I wanted it to look pretty because I was a visual artist. So I was like, wait, this is not the point of this. And nowadays when I journal, it's just like, I will write down any thought that goes in my head, even if it makes no sense. And then afterwards, it's just nice because you can see it all on one page, and you'll
Yeah.
see things pop out at yourself that, you know, they're almost, when you see them all kind of like in one space, it's almost ridiculous how obvious they are or how absurd some of the things you're thinking are, just in terms of anxieties or fears. Like, there have been times where I've been anxious about things. Just the other day, a couple days ago, I was really anxious about something that made no sense. And then I when I saw it on writing, I was like, if someone said this back to me, I would tell them they're ridiculous, because this is so unlikely that this will ever happen, that this is just an absurd fear of yours. So I think that's a good practice. And of course, and I'm not saying all of this from a position of like, I'm perfectly in control and I'm emotionally so sound that I never have anxiety or fear. I
Right. Yeah.
obviously do. Everybody does.
Yeah. No, but
I
it's
don't.
learning how to deal with it. It's not going to go
Exactly.
away for the rest of your life, but learning
Yeah.
how to deal with it, to manage it.
And I think what you said earlier about having a toolkit, it's interesting because a couple weeks ago, it's not that I was attacked or anything on the street, but I had a sort of mild confrontation. I live in LA now. It can be a little bit sketchy at night. And I was at a CVS in the evening. And as I was walking out, it wasn't even that late. It was about 9:30, 10, but the streets were pretty empty. As I was walking to my car, two people kind of confronted me. And what was interesting to me was that there was something like that happened to me about 10 years ago, which was actually much more serious. I was actually attacked in the street when I was 16,
Oh my
living in
gosh.
Paris. And at the time, it created such a big trauma response that I was paranoid and I couldn't even sit in my apartment without feeling unsafe. And I went to stay with my boyfriend for a while. When this happened just a couple weeks ago, I had just come from, I think, Muay Thai or Jiu Jitsu, or maybe both, I'd done that
Yeah.
evening. And I literally didn't flinch when they came at me. And I had actually changed my fear response because I
Wow.
sort of practiced this instinct of, like, I developed this instinct of most people, if they're attacked, they'll kind of panic. And I'm so used to being in that situation physically that when it actually happened in real life, I didn't react to it. And I just kind of, I think the fact that I didn't react to it kind of freaked the people out because
Wow.
I think they expect when you lunge at someone for them to kind of flinch or,
Right.
get scared.
Especially, I mean, especially at a woman.
Yeah. And I think because I literally just kept walking, they sort of looked confused and they walked away. And I was like, wow, that's so interesting how just my body language and the way I carried myself in that situation completely changed what could have been a potentially really bad outcome. That's a very extreme, actually dangerous, potentially dangerous situation. But in our work and in our sort of in this mental chatter of anxiety, I think the more you put yourself in these, like you said, having this toolkit of practicing potentially scary situations like public speaking. Like for me, it also started with starting to address the audience before concerts. The first time I did it, I was terrified. But nowadays, I don't even really prepare. Like I'll talk to an audience, completely ad lib it from stage, and that's again, it's because I have the practice, and it comes from doing it over and over and over, and putting yourself in that vulnerable situation and learning how to face it, that you learn to be comfortable. I feel like I'm sounding so dramatic and extreme because we're talking about this in the context of like the performing arts, and I'm like giving examples of like being attacked in the street, but
But you
it's
know what? It's
all,
relevant. It's
it's
very
relevant and
relevant.
it's interrelated. And I think just for me personally, because martial arts are so big in my life and I do practice them every day, it's a parallel I draw between the two, and it's one that probably most people don't. But like I said, like with sports psychology or speaking in the context of a business meeting, they're all coming from the same place. And I think learning to master those thoughts and emotions is the most important thing.
Absolutely. And they are related. Those thoughts like, well, what if this happens? What would I do in this situation? All of this can be translated even on stage or even in any sort of situation where there's no physical risk, as you say,
Yeah.
but we're creating that mental risk. I've actually, since I started going to therapy, I have removed the phrase, what if, from
Hmm.
my vocabulary because I think I pretty much lived my entire life with every other sentence being what if before
Yeah.
therapy. And now it's like, what am I going to gain from sitting and thinking, well, what if this happens? Well, what if that happens? Well, okay, yeah, what if it happens? Is the world going to end? Am I going to die? Like if I have a memory slip on stage, what's going to happen? If,
Exactly.
if I don't have enough time to prepare for this, what's truly going to happen? Yeah, okay, I don't want to ruin my reputation. I
Right.
don't want to play badly because every performance is important to me because I love it.
Yeah.
So, okay, what can I do to help? I can prepare. For me, for example, the times that I have the most nerves or anxiety come from lack of preparation.
Yes, and actually, that's something when you first told me the topic for this podcast, that was something I really wanted to address because a very, very specific piece of advice that I can give that is completely relevant to, just being an instrumentalist and performing on stage is I have learned throughout the years that the only times when something really does go wrong on stage are when I'm not prepared, and I, more importantly, know I'm not prepared. Because I
Right.
think there's this moment I've realized, it's funny because you can't really lie to yourself when you're on stage. And there have been a couple times I remember where I was not 100% prepared. And it's interesting because no matter what, you get nerves. Like I think nerves are good because, and the preparation for something, if you have nerves, I feel like it's a negative word, but the fact that you have nerves, it also means that you care and you're invested in what's happening, and
Yes.
that's a good
Yeah.
thing. I mean, if you were completely indifferent towards the performance, that's not a good attitude, and that's not going to translate well into your playing either. If you're kind of like, I don't care what this sounds like,
Then
whatever.
it's like, what's the point then?
Exactly. Yeah. And I also personally, we didn't talk about flow states, but that's something I've researched a lot and I find really fascinating because the flow states are very rare for me to achieve. But one place where I know I can always achieve a flow state is when I'm very focused in a performance. And it's actually a really
Mm.
beautiful feeling. And it's probably one of the reasons why we do this. It's probably to get that feeling because it's kind of like it's like a blissful state when you hit that moment of like total focus and being absorbed with what you're doing in a
It's quite
performance.
magical. It's like,
It's
I think it's
very,
the definition of like truly being present in the moment.
yeah, it's funny because I was on a flight a couple weeks ago and I started watching, that Disney Pixar movie, Soul.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and there's that scene where they're like in that dream world where the musicians are playing and they go into like that flow state. That's kind of it's a high that I think all of us are chasing in some way, and it's something I think is one of the best things about performing, especially for a live audience. It has happened that I have hit those states in practice, but it's much harder to get to. But the nerves thing, no matter what, when I'm performing in front of people, I do feel some form of nerves, for lack of a better word. I think nerves can be interchanged with focus. Like
Yeah.
it's a kind of focus.
Heightened
Yeah,
awareness and heightened focus. Yeah.
exactly. I think it's a heightened focus and just sensory awareness. And so I think that's a good thing, but I think how it manifests is completely dependent on your preparation. So if I'm in that
Mm.
hyper focused state and I am not prepared and I know I'm not prepared, it is not going to go well because I think what happens is deep down that this isn't totally ready, and then you're in that like hyper aware, hyper focused state and everything gets amplified and like weird things can happen and fall apart.
And you can
um
psych yourself out thinking like, well, oh
yeah,
shoot, like I'm not prepared. What if I forget the next
exactly.
passage? Like what if I miss that run? Like what if, yeah. And
Yeah,
that's where the what ifs come in. Yeah,
exactly,
exactly.
exactly. And it's almost like, it's funny because I remember when I was in one of the sports psychology books I was reading, and this was probably like 10 years ago, so I can't remember which one it was, but they were talking about, basically he was saying every time he went to pitch, your internal narrative and that internal monologue that's happening in that moment is actually so important because I think what he was saying is like he would focus on where he wanted the ball to go and then it would go there and he would pitch there, whereas if he focused on where he didn't want it to go, and he started this whole internal monologue of like, oh my god, I don't want it to go there because that's not where I want it to go, and if it goes there it'll be like really bad. It's the same thing with when we're playing and there's like a really difficult run or shift, and I have seen myself do this so many times. I'll be like, don't miss it, don't miss it, don't miss it, and then I miss
And
it.
then we miss it.
Whereas,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's funny because if you actually didn't create, it's because that's what you're focusing on, and
Right.
that's
And
where
that's
all.
what you're ending up somehow like attracting. I
Yeah.
wonder if because I think Timothy Galway says the same thing in The Inner Game of Tennis. So I wonder if you're talking about that book even.
Maybe.
And it's essentially that, like, focusing on what it is you want to do and like visualizing that in a way, like visualizing the ball going there. So
Right.
I'll do that even when I'm playing a very difficult passage with like big jumps or something. Like I will
Yeah,
visualize hitting the jump and like hitting
exactly.
the right note. And that's how I practice, but not just on stage. Like I am practicing like the way, when we shoot a basketball, we're aiming and we release with our wrists and we release the ball and we gauge sort of the distance by hit or miss,
Yeah.
and it's the same kind of thing on, I don't know how you deal with it on the cello, but with piano, let's say I'm playing like La Campanella or something and there's like, all these big jumps. I am teaching my arm and my hand the distance of the jump by releasing and aiming.
Yes. And that's going back to the preparation thing, is when you're truly prepared and you've done this over and over and over, you've built that muscle memory. And that is when that heightened focus actually kicks in a good way. Because I found that when I'm really well prepared, I don't have these distracting thoughts. And then I sort of just go into this almost autopilot sort of like feeling, and things just automatically happen because I've practiced them so much that my hands just know from muscle memory where to go. And I think that is the key to really good performance, is actually being prepared and also knowing that you're prepared. Because I have been in really stressful situations where I should have been nervous, and there could have been so much room for error, but because I was so well prepared in the moment, it's almost like that muscle memory overrides any sort of weird anxieties that might pop up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the ideal achieved state is a combination of muscle memory, brain, and spontaneity.
Absolutely.
Well, what a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for being so open with us and for sharing so much of your own personal history, with anxiety and with performance and with so many things, because I think many people can relate. And it's not an easy topic talking about anxiety. It's not an easy situation to be willing and able to be vulnerable in any sort of situation. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for creating this space.
Thank you all so much for listening. I am truly grateful for the support from each and every one of you. If you would like to submit any questions or topics for us to address on the show, you can send us a message on our Instagram page at Conscious Artist Podcast. Help us to spread more awareness by sharing this episode with your friends, your colleagues, your teachers, and your students. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sending you all so much love and strength to tackle this week, and we'll see you next Monday for another episode of The Conscious Artist.